And I would say like the more important thing is to do what energizes you, right? I think the number of hours metric is a bit superficial
Yeah.
because you could be doing 40 hours but not enjoying your work at all. You could be doing 70 hours a week and loving it, right? And so if you're doing work that energizes you, if you're passionate about social impact, if you like the people you work with, I think that makes a big difference.
For value is a consultant adding in co-creation.
There's this pattern recognition piece, which is we come in with an outside in view saying, oh, like, we've actually seen a similar problem in X geography, or we've seen a similar problem in Y sector. This is how it was tackled there. Here are some best practices, learnings, lessons. Let's see if we can apply those in this context, right? And then use very high amount of analytical rigor to go through this process of generating ideas and then filtering them down into what makes most sense in that context, right? Like people are so deep in their operational work, clients often, right, that they don't have this bandwidth to engage in this process by themselves. And that's where this consulting firm can come in and actually do this very interesting piece of work in a short span of time, right? Like in 4 months, it's pretty intense in that sense. Like if you think of it, like you're trying to solve a multi-year problem.
Today, I have the distinct pleasure of hosting Keshav Kanoria on my podcast. Keshav, a social impact consultant with the Bridgespan Group, has been in social impact consulting for a decade and a half now, with experience across board in some reputed consulting firms, including Dalberg, Boston Consulting Group, Ernst& Young. Keshav was born in the city of Joy, Kolkata. Keshav holds a MBA from Indian School of Business and has worked in investment banking and finance before joining the social impact space. Welcome to Policy Pod, Keshav. It's a pleasure to host you today.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity.
Keshav, while I've given a brief introduction of your career journey and your work, would love to hear more from you about the same, particularly your switch to the social impact consulting and the motivations to do that, and how did you get into this?
Sure. Yeah, so like you were mentioning, I have about kind of lost track also now, but about 17 years of experience. I did about 2.5 pre MBA, which was focused on the financial services, did some equity research and portfolio management at that time. And then post MBA, basically, I wanted to make the switch to consulting, right? And that came a year after I graduated. So 2010 onwards, I've been in the consulting industry, of which the first 4.5 years were more focused on commercial consulting, kind of, but focused on the education sector, which is what I did at Ernst& Young. And then since then, I've made the switch to impact. So 2015 onwards is when I really made the switch to impact consulting, where I started focusing more on kind of working with the government, with philanthropists, with NGOs, and other bodies which are social purpose. Yeah, and this, I guess, this switch to social impact was like partly by design and partly serendipity. I was essentially kind of looking to round out my consulting experience in education, which I was mentioning I had at Ernst& Young, but that was more focused on private sector clients. I wanted to round that out with experience with government, with development sector, because they play a big role in education in the country. And so that opportunity came about at BCG Social Impact. Actually, I happened to meet one of my seniors from school at a conference, and he was at BCG at that time. And he said, we're looking for someone who has experience in education, who has passion for the space, and who's open to work with the government and other kind of development clients. And I was like, yeah, this is a great fit. And so it kind of the journey started from there, right? So that's why I was saying, like, partially like by design and partially by serendipity. And then since then, it's been like one thing kind of just led to another. So I did 2 years at BCG, and then I wanted to kind of broaden my experience in development. And so when I moved to Dalberg, I started doing work across different sectors, different types of clients, even across geographies. So while most of my work was focused on India, I ended up touching like parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and some other geographies as well. So that really broadened my experience in social impact, and then I'm carrying forward that broader exposure to Bridgespan, where I'm working with primarily with philanthropists, both institutional and individual. I've also done some work with CSR and some work with NGOs as well. Right. So it's been like a fairly broad and diverse exposure with, I would say, a spike in kind of education, skilling, that segment. Yeah, it's been a very interesting journey. Kind of happy to talk more about it.
Lovely. And if I had to decode the word social impact consulting, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so I mean, in simple terms, it is applying strategic thinking and analytical skills to solving kind of real world, very complex, multidimensional social and environmental problems. Right. So it's applying that the consulting mindset, but to social problems versus commercial problems.
Okay. And when you're doing that, what does a week or a month in your day look like?
Yeah, so I think first off, like that, there's no typical. Like every day, every week, every month kind of looks different. Also, at different stages of your journey, it looks different, right? So, as a consultant, it looks different versus a manager versus, as you start to move towards partnership. That mix changes kind of over time, right? But I would say, kind of, if you take a project life cycle, right, which is what kind of that's our unit typically, right? So each project lasts about three to 4 months. Like that mix, I mean, that time is a mix of like research and analysis, which takes about like a substantial portion of the time. I would say like more than 50%. Then there's a piece around communication, which is where like kind of both verbal communication and written communication, which is where you're drafting up the materials, the outputs, and then you're presenting it to clients and internal stakeholders. That is kind of next big piece of work that you do in a project. And then the third is the administrative and management aspects, right? Which is like the process management, the stakeholder management, things like that. Like that would be the next substantial piece of work. So that's on a project itself. And then there are things you do outside of a project, right? For example, you might do business development, you might do some firm building initiative, for example, recruitment, training, culture building, so on and so forth. So then that would take up some time as well. So for me personally, I end up spending about 90% of my time on project work, and I do two projects at one time, and then 10% I end up doing on business development and firm building.
Sure, sure. Another thing that intrigues me personally also about social impact consulting is the whole generalist approach that you have to have with you've moved from sector to sector working on skilling, education, health, urban development, and so on and so forth. What do you think are the advantages of being a generalist in social impact consulting and the perils of it?
Yeah, I think great question. So I would say, I mean, first off, like, there are now different choices as well, right? So you don't have to be a generalist,
Yeah.
but just the stage we're at right now in impact consulting in the country, it's about a decade old, right? That's when Dalberg, the Satwa Samagras of the world kind of came about around the 2009, 10, 12 time period. Bridgespan came a little later, and other firms have also come up along the way. But it's a fairly nascent industry, right? So if you just see the total number of people who are doing strategic work in impact, it's a fairly small number, right? If you compare it to commercial consulting, which is a lot more mature. And so in that sense, like, you don't have the scale right now for people to start to specialize early on. And so while you still might have some spike areas that you develop over time, whether it's a sector or a function or a type of client, typically you'll end up doing a fairly broad spread of work, just given the stage at which the industry is in right now. But having said that, like other options have come up over time, like I was mentioning, right? So for example, if you have a passion and a love and an expertise for behavior change, there are actually advisory firms that focus on behavior change. If you want to do like really implementation support at scale, then there are firms like Samagra, right? Which where you're actually working with governments directly, you're embedded with them and actually doing stuff to make things happen in real time, right? So now these different options have come up, which you don't have to stay a generalist. You can take one of those options up if there's a good fit. Yeah, but I love being a generalist personally, because for me, what I love is problem solving, and I like the diversity of work that you get case after case, right? Today I could be solving a case in early childhood education. Tomorrow I could be doing something in public health, right? Or I could be doing something in the space of impact funds, right? And so just the constant challenge keeps your learning curve very steep, because you have to come up to speed, ramp up, within a short span of time when you start a new project, and actually, give very high quality answers to people who probably know much more than you do in that space. But then you have the distinct ability to kind of recognize patterns across projects, which clients often might not be able to do because they are so kind of deep on one particular topic or one particular problem, right? Whereas a consultant, you can see a broad spectrum of work and you're able to connect the dots and kind of recognize patterns. So I particularly find that very like interesting and challenging. I mean, the perils, of course, are that content wise, you perhaps don't get to go as deep on something, right? Every 4 months, you're doing something new, and so for people who really enjoy going deep on a particular area, this might not allow them that opportunity.
Understandable. A lot of actors say this, that when they do a particular role and they get into that character on some level stays with them for a really long time. uh, Given that you have had that similar journey where you're not getting into character but at least into a sector where you're building knowledge, understanding it, and then after 4 months or 6 months, whenever the project ends, you move on to another sector. What's if I were to talk about your work, let's say in 2017 or 2016, working on education or something you did at Dalberg in urban health, how do you like look at those sectors in terms of your understanding and knowledge today?
Yeah, so I think like I was mentioning, kind of general consulting gives you the opportunity to kind of dip your toes in several areas, right? And there are just so many problems to solve in the world that I find that very fascinating, right? Like today you're solving one problem, like day after you're solving some other problem, and these are all very important, right? I wouldn't say that one is more important than the other. um, yeah, and like I was mentioning, like there's this ability to find patterns across problems, right? Whether you're solving an education problem or you're solving a health problem or a sanitation problem, there might be some common underlying challenges, right? For example, there might be the lack of implementation capacity in government or other actors. There might be some change needed on the policy front. There might be some technical or innovative solutions needed. There might be some behavioral change and awareness needed amongst the masses and the public, right? So there's eventually, like when you start to diagnose the issues at the root, a lot of problems feel similar, right? And that's where that ability to kind of connect the dots comes in, which is, oh, like I actually faced a similar issue in the education sector, and so can we apply some of those interesting kind of methods and innovations in some other sector. And so that ability to kind of and even internationally, if you look at stuff, right, you're solving problems in India, but someone in Africa might have faced a similar issue, or someone in Southeast Asia might have faced a similar issue and solved it well. Why can't you apply some of those learnings back in India, right? So I think just the ability to, like, laterally think and connect is has been supremely helpful.
That I would love to deep dive into this interconnectedness. Could you give me an example of, let's say, there's a particular problem that you've found in whatever project you have been working on where you felt, okay, there's a interconnectedness in terms of implementation challenges or anything, and how did you go about that?
Yeah, so I remember, like, we had done a very interesting project at Dalberg on sanitation workers, and some of this knowledge is even public. You can probably look it up. There's some reports, etc. And when we started to kind of look under the hood on the issue of sanitation workers in India, we were just trying to understand how many sanitation workers there are, like what kinds of work do they do, etc. But apart from that, what are some of the issues that they face in their day-to-day lives, whether it's financial issues, social issues, health issues, and what are the underlying reasons for that, right? There were like three or four buckets that we came up with. One is behavioral issues, right, which is sanitation workers, for example, might have safety equipment, but they might not use it, right? And so that's a behavior problem. The second is more technical and infrastructural issues, which is, do you have the right kind of infrastructure in terms of sewers, septic tanks, toilets? So that's an infrastructure thing, right? Do you have the right safety gear? Do you have the right personal protective equipment? So those are all infrastructure and technical issues. The third is policy issues, right? Which is, do you have the right kind of policy incentives? Do you have the right kind of policy frameworks to safeguard the rights of sanitation workers, to actually give them the right set of tools, etc., to make their life better, right? And then the fourth are like financial issues. Is the government putting enough budget behind this? Are other philanthropies and other private sector players, sufficiently funding this area? So that's a financial issue, right? And then when we unpack this, is when you're like, oh, like, you know what, like there might be similar issues. For example, in the area of nutrition, there are also several behavioral issues, right? For example, that an intervention like breastfeeding works really well, but are mothers really doing that, on a day-to-day basis exclusively for 6 months? You know that supplements work really well, but are people taking that on time? And often we find they don't, right? And that's a behavioral problem. The supplement is available, but people are actually not consuming it on time or adhering to the routine, right? And so can you borrow learnings from nutrition and put that into the behavioral issue in sanitation workers? And so there's that interesting connect kind of that can be made, like what are learnings from somewhere else where. So that's number one. And the second thing that you realize is a lot of social problems are interrelated anyways. For example, if people are not going sufficiently to school, if they're not attending school, or they're dropping out of school, that's just not an education problem. It actually goes beyond and touches many other topics. For example, are girls feeling safe in schools? So there's something around gender equity. People are boys being pulled out of school to work in their farms, right? That's a livelihoods problem. Are there girls' toilets in the school? That's a sanitation problem. So to solve the education problem, you actually need to look at many other sectors that kind of dovetail into solving that problem.
That's good to know. When we talk about social impact consulting, I see three broad pillars of that, which is one is the government advisory services, the second is not for profit, and third is working with donors and philanthropies and CSRs. Would you like help us decode them a little and understand and kind of contrast it for us in terms of what are the similarities and what are the differences when it comes to these three pillars?
In consulting these three
Yes.
different kinds of actors.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think great point. Thanks for bringing it up. So I think at the outset, I would say, just every actor has a very crucial, important role to play in solving development problems. Right? Unless you get this nexus of government, private, and development kind of working together well, you won't get to solve problems effectively at scale. Right? And so I've had the good fortune of having touched each of these actors along my consulting career. Like I've done some work for the government for approximately. I did like one piece of work for the government of Haryana over a year at BCG. BCG actually had a longer contract, but I was on it for a year. I also worked with a couple of other governments over time. NGOs I've also touched a little bit over my consulting career, and then I've done a bunch of work for donors, whether it's institutional or individual. The distinctions that come to my mind are as follows, right? So when you think about government consulting, you need to kind of commit for the long term, right? Typically, I mean, these tend to be long term contracts, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. There could be a design piece, a strategy piece, typically followed up with implementation support. And so the willingness to commit for that long term, to have that patience, to have the persistence, right? And be willing to like roll up your sleeves and get things done. I think that is very important. You also have to be willing to, there's always uncertainty in terms of the leadership, the government leadership, right? Because the bureaucrat who's leading the project might actually be in some other department a year from now. And so there'll be a new leadership, they might want some changes, or you might need to like build buy-in, etc. again. And so you have to be prepared for that kind of change and a bit of ambiguity. In terms of NGO consulting, I would say it's like, in the commercial space, the way you consult private sector enterprises, like it's similar in that sense, right? They're looking at entry strategy, they're looking at growth strategy, they might look at funding model, operating model, like, support on those aspects. But oftentimes NGOs don't have both the bandwidth, because the leadership is just so strapped for time, they're doing so many different things, and they might not have very mature systems and processes, right? Whether it's financial systems and so on and so forth. And so again, there might be like some data scarcity. You might need to actually work back with them to extract the data that you want, because it's not readily available, right?
What kind of a value is a consultant adding in that co-creation?
Yeah, so I would say just having that neutral perspective, saying that okay, let's hear all the sides. You know, we've heard experts, we've heard people internally, we've heard, this, that. We can piece the different pieces together, right? And we have the right sets of tools and methodologies to do that. Can we run a workshop? Yes. We can run a visioning workshop, we can run a brainstorming workshop, so on and so forth. Do we have the right sets of communication capabilities? Yes. Like, can we interview 50 people? Yes, like a consultant can do that. And then apart from that, like I was mentioning, there's this pattern recognition piece, which is we come in with an outside in view saying, oh, like, we've actually seen a similar problem in X geography, or we've seen a similar problem in Y sector. This is how it was tackled there. Here are some best practices, learnings, lessons. Let's see if we can apply those in this context, right? And then use very high amount of analytical rigor to go through this process of generating ideas and then filtering them down into what makes most sense in that context, right? Like, people are so deep in their operational work, clients often, right, that they don't have this bandwidth to engage in this process by themselves. And that's where this consulting firm can come in and actually do this very interesting piece of work in a short span of time, right? Like in 4 months, it's pretty intense in that sense. Like, if you think of it, like you're trying to solve a multi-year problem and coming up with, a reasonably good answer in a span of 3 to 4 months.
And I think one of the other things that comes to my mind, and I would love to have your view, is while there's a lot of co creation and consultants are solving problems that have not been solved for years, which is also true for government. Another facet I think with government consulting is that they're also expecting a little bit of an implementation support as compared to other clients that you may have. What's your experience or perspective on that?
Yes, I mean, so eventually, kind of the rubber hits the road when you actually implement stuff, right? That's when your recommendations actually are tested. Like, you can do as much feasibility analysis as you want, right? You can do impact assessment and so on at the time of actually generating ideas and prioritizing them. But when you start to implement them is when the true test happens, right? That's the moment of truth. And I think that's what a lot of clients, not just government, right, but even CSR and others, they say, okay, kind of, let's demonstrate that this actually works, right? It's perhaps not enough to say on a piece of paper that this might work. Let's help me make it happen,
Yeah.
is the language. And I think a lot of, like, people, even the commercial consulting world, things have moved to like success based fees and so on and so forth.
Hmm. Okay. And for the viewers who are interested in exploring a career in social impact consulting, what would you say is how should one decide if consulting is something for them? And a related question around it is what are firms looking for when they hire consultants?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So let me start with the latter first, right, which is what do firms look for. Essentially, it's like similar to any other consulting setup. We look for high quality analytical skills, right? What's the kind of analytical rigor you can bring? What's the different perspectives and so on? The second is communication skills, just given how core that is to our work. Like, we have to write up work products almost every day. They have to be client ready, good quality stuff. You need to be able to present that work to clients and internally. So communication is very important. And the third is your project management skill. right? Your ability to manage your own work stream, ability to manage a larger case, if you're hiring a manager, for example, right? And the ability to work with a team, right? So team player, what's your attitude? Are you generally easy to get along with, etc.? So those are kind of three, four hard and soft skills we look for. Apart from that, we look for demonstrated interest and passion for social impact. And that could take different shapes and forms, right? Someone might have done volunteering work earlier in a meaningful way, right? And so that would count towards demonstrated interest. Someone might have done some pro bono consulting work as part of their undergraduation or post graduation, or even while working. Someone might do something alongside. Or someone might have held leadership positions in clubs, social impact clubs in their school or college or B school or whatever, right? So some form of demonstrated interest in social impact. I would say like these are the two core buckets, the kind of hard and soft skills with respect to consulting, and then that, right? The third thing I would say is a bit of an attitudinal thing, right? It's the humility that someone brings and the curiosity to learn, because there's so much which is still unsolved, needs to be solved. You need to learn constantly every 4 months. Like I was saying, you're on a new case, it's a new sector. So there's a curiosity that you need to have, and the humility that you actually don't know much, right? Like you will learn along the way. And also to be able to deal with stakeholders across the board, whether it's an end user sitting in a village, it could be a self-help group member, a woman, it could be a boardroom guy, right? So you're straddling a pretty broad spectrum of stakeholders you have to interact with, engage with. And so the humility to be able to do that in a way that's respectful is very important to us as well. And so from a candidate perspective, I mean, it's pretty much the same thing, right? You want to be asking yourself these questions. Do
Yeah.
I have the right set of skills? Do I really have passion and interest for social impact? Because it's a long game, right? Eventually, like you won't see outcomes in 6 months.
Yeah.
You're going to be seeing outcomes in 5 years. And do I have that ability to straddle the stakeholder spectrum? Am I really curious about social sector problems and so on and so forth? And so if the answer to those things is yes, then sure, I mean, great. But the more the merrier. I really encourage people to think deeply about whether they want to apply their skills, their resources, their knowledge to solving tough social problems. Like it's the need of the hour, and just not enough. We're just not getting enough talent into the social impact space, like more broadly. I'm not just talking
Yeah.
consulting right now,
Yeah.
but I'm saying social impact itself is so broad, that depending on your skills and your interests and aptitude, etc., like you can find a fit somewhere. Whether it's a multilateral, whether it's an NGO, whether it's a government body, whether it's an impact investor, whether it's a consultant, like there's a whole spectrum of opportunities out there.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we should talk about is how there has been a steady, if not like what is ideal, but a steady change in the perception in terms of pay when it comes to social sector. I think last decade we have seen the kind of opportunities and the kind of pay that is offered in social impact has kind of changed, but in the same breath we can talk about how there's still a little bit of a difference when it comes to pay. And I think you've once talked about the philanthropy pay discount in one of your posts. So would you like to share more on what do you think, what's your perspective on the pay discount or the pay difference in the social sector?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so is there a pay difference? Yes, right? For the same set of skills, you take a tech guy in the social sector, you take a tech guy in a corporate, they're not getting paid the same amount, even though they might have the same skills, they might be doing similar kinds of work, so on and so forth. Right? And that's a function of, I think, just historically, like legacy. There's a bit of like legacy here, right? Because just NGOs have not paid well for a very long time. I think it also came from this fact that people come from the goodness of their heart. It's more a volunteering type thing. People should be willing to take a discount, therefore, because they're internally motivated. They don't need extrinsic motivation like money to drive them, and so on and so forth. I think that's one reason for it. The second is that funders have typically not paid significant amounts to NGOs for administrative purposes, right? Which could be a function of regulation, which regulation might not allow the funding of that as much. But then funder mindsets, right? I think they're like, let's put as much money to work on programs which are
Yeah.
going to end beneficiaries
Yeah.
versus let's strengthen the organizations which are actually running those programs, which is where we need good staff, we need good systems and processes, and so we need to invest more behind organization development and administrative purposes. I think that mindset shift is taking some time, is starting to happen, right? And you can see a lot of now progressive NGOs, progressive funders who are doing that kind of stuff. But I would say it's still some distance to go. So kind of from that side, there's not enough money kind of flowing in to actually bridge this compensation gap. But at the same time, I would encourage people to think a little differently about this, right? One, like, compensation is one indicator,
Aspect. Yeah.
right? One aspect of your full package,
Yeah.
right? You have to think about, okay, what's the impact potential I have here? What learning and growth can I get? Can I pick up new skills? Can I learn new sectors? Can I interact with a broad range of stakeholders, etc.? So there's a whole lot of kind of learning and development. There's a work-life balance angle. Maybe in the corporate side, I might have to work 70, 80 hours a week, right? Here, maybe I have to do 50 hours a week. And so kind of are those choices, what kind of works for me? And therefore there's no one right answer for anyone. It's kind of what works for them. But I would therefore encourage people to look at that full package versus just looking at compensation. That's just one
Yeah.
part of
Yeah, and I think just in terms of if we had to compare any corporate numbers to the sheer impact or sheer volume of impact in terms of the number of people impacted in the not-for-profit sector, it's just crazy. The comparison is crazy. The number is crazy. So I think yeah, and the sector is growing. The sector is growing. I think a lot of us are very optimistic about the kind of impact, like it has taken a decade from like where we were a decade back to come here and have so many opportunities already. So god knows where we will be in the next 10 years. And
it.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
no, absolutely. I'm like excited about what's to come.
yeah.
The social sector services or social sector infrastructure is the way we define it, which is kind of the broader
Yeah.
ecosystem that supports social sector growth. I think that has evolved and kind of in a pretty substantial way in the last decade, like you're saying, right? There have been so many firms that have come up that don't do just advisory, but then there's some research firms. There's monitoring and evaluation firms. There are communications firms, HR, finance. So many now actors are supporting development actors, right? NGOs, philanthropists, and so on. It's very exciting. I think it's a natural thing to happen, and I'm glad it's happened in our time, that we all have these opportunities in front of
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, and I think we're starting at a time when there are very few people in it. So anyone who gets that head start would reap the benefits in the coming years. I think one of the things that when we think consultants, we think long hours, and I think it's a very detail oriented sort of work with such long hours. How do you cope with it? What's your strategy to be able to put in that much of hard work week after week and year after year?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is like, what is long? Right? It's all relative. I mean, for me, it's been, BCG, for example, was a little longer, but at Bridgespan, for example, I'm doing about 50-55 hours a week, right? Which seems like quite manageable to me. I think,
Yeah,
given I have a family as well, I have a wife, I have two young kids who are 7 years old, I have a dog, so a pretty full family, full house. There's a lot to manage. I have my own personal interests as well, but I think the amount of work I need to do at Bridgespan leaves me enough time for those other aspects as well. And I would say like the more important thing is to do what energizes you, right? I think the number of hours metric is a bit superficial,
yeah,
because you could be doing 40 hours but not enjoying your work at all. You could be doing 70 hours a week and loving it, right? And so if you're doing work that energizes you, if you're passionate about social impact, if you like the people you work with, I think that makes a big difference. And there are times like I've gone over and above that from my own free will to actually read up on the social sector or build new
yeah,
connections. I don't treat that as part of work,
yeah.
because that's something naturally I want to do to drive towards greater impact.
Yeah, that's very relatable. I think a part of me was expecting that answer when I asked that question, and I completely agree with you. I think another thing that social impact consultants are really good at, and something when you talk about talent, more talent in the broader social impact space can kind of use it, is just the communication. Just your ability to communicate well is something that is really appreciated when it comes to social impact consultant. Do you have any advice for our listeners in terms of how do you build that kind of communication skills?
I mean, honestly, you learn a little bit through your education, of course. Like, the school you go to, the college, etc. Eventually, when you come to the consulting world and you realize that the PPT you made in college actually wasn't that great, is when you get a bit of a reality check, right? And then it comes through practice. I think a lot of it comes through practice. You have to build a muscle memory that you start behaving in a certain way just naturally. It takes a while. It takes a few projects to actually learn how to make a good deck, right? Or it takes a few times to present internally, actually start to become more fluent, and so on and so forth. And then kind of you move from there to presenting to the client and so on. So you can first do it internally in a more risk-free space, and then you move to external. And then there are
Mm.
tips to actually do it well, right? Like for example, it always makes sense, could be helpful to do a dry run, right?
Yeah,
Do a dry run with peers to see, okay, how am I presenting? Are my points kind of hitting home? What do I need to change, etc. The second is having a set of talking points at the back, right? Like on this slide, I want to be hitting one, two, three messages, right? On next slide, I want to be hitting these messages. So I think that really helps for people who are starting out on that journey, and then from that, it just becomes muscle memory from practice.
fair enough. Fair enough. And Keshav, you were among one of the first batches of Indian School of Business MBA, and it's been more than 10 years. It's almost been 15 years since you graduated. In hindsight, what do you think you took away from that and you continue to take away from that experience?
Yeah, no, I would say like I love that experience. I recently went to my 15th year kind of alumni reunion, and got to reconnect with some of my older batchmates who I hadn't met in a very long time. So that's clearly one takeaway. I mean, you have these 450 people who've studied with you for that year. It's been an intense year. You build some pretty deep bonds and connections, and so those people can be good sounding boards. Even if they're not in the same industry, they might have faced a similar problem, whether it's to do with client management, team management. There's some of these softer aspects that everyone goes through, and so they become kind of useful sounding boards, or even people who can give you advice on some things like that. Some of them are also in social impact, right? And so they naturally become part of your kind of network and go to when you need help on something, or you want to collaborate on something as well. And then there's of course the content of it. It is what you learned in that year. I think lots of interesting courses that we did, and which I still find very relevant. I think a lot of concepts are very relevant. Whether it's marketing concepts, for example. Now there's no marketing in the social impact space, but there's behavior change, there's awareness generation.
Yeah.
They very much you very much apply the principles of marketing over there. Or let's say if you're looking at social ROI, if you're trying to compute that for a program, then you're looking at principles of finance, right? And so there's lots of these things which are fungible, which cut across industry. So irrespective of whether you're in social impact or commercial or government or whatever, it would find its way into the work that you do.
Okay. And in terms of w- the current scenario when it comes to going for your masters, there's a debate between the MPP versus MPA versus a specialized degree. Do you have any perspective on that?
So I don't know enough about kind of the MPP MPA curriculum, but what I can say is, like, depending on your specific goal, like where do you look at yourself 5 years down, 10 years down, what kind of actor do you want to be part of, what role do you see yourself playing? I think you'll have to make the choice accordingly. MBA is of course a little more generic, it's broader. I think that'll apply to a broader set of firms. so on and so forth, but it won't be as specialized in terms of the kind of policy work, etc., that you'll get to do as part of an MPP, right? And so like it'll eventually boil down to kind of what's your 5 year, 10 year kind of horizon and goal.
Okay. And one of the things that you have talked about quite a bit, and I think is very important for the social impact space, is impact measurement. And I think there's a huge debate and a kind of confusion around how do you report numbers, because sometimes the work is not like measurable in terms of numbers, sometimes it's more qualitative. I think there's a general comfort levels which also the NGOs and social sector have in terms of being able to report qualitatively as compared to quantitatively. What's your perspective on impact measurement, and especially given impact investing and everything is a very up and coming field, and that would require a little more of rigor in terms of impact measurement. What's your perspective on it?
Yeah, I'm all for data to start with. So yeah, I agree with you. I think one thing that we shy away from maybe in the social impact space is the use of data. Like we are happy living in this kind of situation where you're getting mostly qualitative feedback, whether it's from beneficiaries or other people, and then you're synthesizing that, you're figuring out the way forward based on that and so on. But there's not enough application of data to decision making, right? And so wherever we can use data, let's use it. And there are interesting like creative ways to kind of indicators that you can use as proxies, as well as how you can collect the data now. I think now that we are in this era where there's so much technology available, everyone pretty much has a phone, if not a smartphone. I know that lots of NGOs and donors are actively thinking about how do you capture the data from beneficiaries now, right? Which otherwise would not have been available earlier, let's say 3 years back or 5 years back, could now be possible, right? And then secondly, how do you get creative about other indicators, right? Other proxies that one could use. So for example, if you want to sense what's the demand for X service, you might not get that data right away, but you can use creative proxies to figure, okay, like these could be leading signals for that. And so I would wish that people use that kind of stuff more and more versus relying purely on qualitative evidence, right? And then sometimes I think evidence backed decision making might be a bit of an overkill, might be an over engineering, especially in situations where you're doing innovation, for example. Right now, you're trying to build a product or service which might never have been built earlier. How do you take evidence backed decisions in that case, right? Sometimes you have to just go with your gut, your instinct, and like I mentioned, there might be signals and cues that might point you to a certain direction, but you might not have hard data to back up your decision, and that's fine. I think in a lot of situations you need that data, but in some situations you don't. And so to be able to make that judgment call of where to use what, what kind of data, how do you collect it, so on and so forth, is all an evolving field right now in M&E.
Yeah. I think another very interesting thing that you talk about in one of your articles, which is now 6 years back, is mergers and acquisition in the not-for-profit sector. And in that article, you argue about how that's happening all across the world, but not as much in India. And you cite some figures from US and all of that. And I would love for you to tell us a little more about that to our audience, about the concept of mergers and acquisitions in for not-for-profit one. And second, do you think this scenario has changed since you wrote that article?
Yeah. No, thanks so much for bringing it up. So actually, I don't think it's happening a lot in the US as well, right? It's fairly small across the world. In India, it's pretty negligible. I would say it's close to zero even now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that article that you're talking about just lays out the rationale for why someone might want to consider at least why a merger or acquisition might make sense in the
Yeah.
nonprofit space. Of course, there are regulatory issues around it. For example, it's not you can't really purchase a trust, that kind of stuff. So you'll have to kind of figure the way around regulation. But just conceptually, it feels like this is something that should be explored further because there are inefficiencies in the way we currently operate. Right, like the full NGO sector in India is highly fragmented and subscale. There are thousands and thousands of NGOs. In fact, there are 16,000 FCRA registered NGOs. And then if you take NGOs outside of that, then there's another like few thousand, right? And so if you're looking at those many NGOs servicing constituents in the country, and most of them are less than $1 million budget, right? Which is 8 crores or below. In fact, most will be like $500,000 or less, or even lesser. They're not being able to reach their full potential, right? And they're somewhat operating inefficiently. And I'll tell you why, right? So if for example there's a school in X village or X district, or a set of schools in X district, and you have five service providers who are servicing that school, right? Someone is doing curriculum development, someone else is doing leadership development, someone else is doing assessment, right? So there are three, four service providers servicing that one set of schools. Now they all have their backends in terms of finance, HR, ops, IT, so on and so forth. They all have their respective programs. They all have their funder bases. Now, if those three organizations were to be merged into one, there would be an um, impact unlock, because now suddenly, instead of you know three small organizations, there's one somewhat larger organization that can perhaps now reach out to more people because of their size. Um, they would also kind of have they can rationalize the back end, because now instead of three HR teams, three finance team, three ops teams, there's one team, right? And so the impact per dollar will reduce
Yeah. Yeah.
as you merge these organizations, right? So that's my sense. And even from a customer point of view, right? So let's say those districts or those schools in that district, now they were having to deal with three service providers. Now they'll have to just deal with one, right? So imagine the simplicity for them. The complexity just gets reduced, right? Because now the number of service providers is reduced. They have a single point of accountability, that this service provider can now provide something more comprehensive as well. Because earlier it might be doing just curriculum development or just teacher training or just something else. Now it's got like three, four services under its umbrella. And so it can take a more holistic, comprehensive package. So they're different. I feel it could be a win-win-win for all the stakeholders here, but it needs to be, of course, explored further from a legal angle and financial angle and so on.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. And I think if all of those regulations and legal angles were cleared, I think it could be hugely beneficial for also NGO founders, because there are times when founders are unable to leave the NGO simply because a lot of it is dependent on them. But if they were to be merged with another NGO or another entity, it may be easier for the founder to leave and maybe start something else or do something else that they're
Yeah,
interested in. So yeah,
it
yeah.
could create exit opportunities. I mean, at the same time, the founder mindset can also be a block, which is, I believe my organization's unique, and I have a very differentiated proposition, and I feel I can crack a certain problem. I don't want to be merging with someone else who I might not align in terms of values and philosophy and at their thinking and so on. Like, I want to have control over my operation, right? And so the willingness to merge might be blocked by the founder mindset, and so it could work kind of both ways, right? So
I think this brings me to something which I'm very excited about, because we are introducing this segment for the first time in my podcast, which is the rapid fire segment. I'm not going to be asking you any scandalous questions, so you can be rest assured about that. But we have some simple questions which you may answer a little rapidly, but you may take your time to like expand on them. It's completely fine. So I'll start with your permission on the rapid fire.
oh, please.
Yeah, Keshav, if not social impact consulting, what do you think you would have liked to do or would be doing?
Probably something to do with music. I mean, I like music a lot. I play the guitar, I sing a little bit. And actually, during my undergrad days, I'd applied for this very unique course called Music Business Management
Oh,
to the
wow.
US. I applied to the US. I didn't end up going. That's a different story. Yeah, and so I could have been like managing some kind of music business, or like a big music event property or something.
Oh,
I mean, I
wow.
would still like to be associated with Coke Studio, for example, in some way. If I could help kind of design that or manage, I would love it.
Oh wow, that's so exciting. A few friends have been doing that in case I could introduce you to them ever. That would be nice. Oh, the second question is your most exciting project until now and why?
So this sanitation workers thing is something I mentioned earlier as well, right? At Dalberg, I think this was definitely a very eye-opening project for me, right? It
Hmm.
very depressing topic, but very eye-opening, right? I got to interact, like I actually got to see them working on the ground, doing different kinds of sanitation work, right? And I could see what it takes and the struggles that they faced, right? So just unpacking that whole piece on sanitation workers, it was a bit of a blind spot in terms of research. Like not a lot of research has been done on that topic, and so we it was a blind spot, right? And so we unpacked just how many sanitation workers there are in the country, what kind of work do they do, what kind of challenges do they face, and then what might be good solutions to think about to help alleviate the situation. So that was a very interesting project.
Okay. A book that has left a big mark on you.
There's no book that comes to mind as such, but there are a few documentaries that I've seen which I love.
Okay.
Like I'm more of a watcher than a reader.
Okay.
Like Planet Earth, for example, is has been very impactful in terms of the environment angle, right? Just the biodiversity, the need for biodiversity, the need for environmental protection, and so on. I watched that with my kids, and yeah, it's a very well made piece of work and very impactful.
A big realization or a aha moment that you have had while working on social impact, or even a funny incident for that matter.
The big insight for me is that this is a long game. Like it's not something you realize early on in your consulting career. You feel like, oh, like I'll deliver a project today, kind of 1 year from now everything will be going awesome, like that organization will be implementing everything, impact will be happening, and it often doesn't play out that way, right? Like, ground realities kick in. Some things don't get implemented, some things do. Some people are faster at it, some people are not, and and that's a reality you live with, right? And so that's been a big learning for me. Like you've just got to keep doing your best day to day, and then a lot of it is beyond your control, and you've got to live with that.
Hmm. But when you move on from a project, even if like it takes 5 years to actually for it to work out, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's okay. I mean, eventually you get to see outcomes a long time after a long time, but you do get to see, shorter term changes as well. Like for example, if a client is kind of getting internal buy-in on the recommendations, that is step number one. Then that person, then the client actually makes a strategy to implement some of your recommendations, right? That is
Yeah,
step number two. Then they actually start to implement it. That's step number three. So as long as you're seeing these things happen along the way, that itself gives comfort. You're not necessarily waiting for the end outcomes to play out, because
sure,
that would
sure.
be a long time.
Okay. And I think my last question is if you could do something differently, what would you change in your career?
Yeah, I don't know, nothing comes to mind right now.
Oh, that's just indicates you've had a wonderful career with not a lot of regrets then.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like I was mentioning, some things happened with serendipity. Had I moved into social impact consulting sooner, like things might have
Yeah,
been different, who knows?
yeah, yeah,
Because I did spend 2.5 years in financial services, I spent a year in media. Like you might ask the question, oh, like were they really helpful to what you're doing now? I did my CFA earlier, like, is that really helpful to what I'm doing now? But those were calls that I took at that point in time thinking that's the best for me,
yeah.
and then things changed over time. So yeah.
I think that's a wonderful approach. And any parting advice you have for our listeners, which are people who are aspiring to be in the policy sector and social impact sector, people who are already there for the last 2 to 10 years, any advice for them?
Yeah, I would say like just seriously consider how you can contribute. And contribution can happen in so many ways. I mean, you can donate dollars, you can give your time, you can give your expertise, your skills. The social sector is wide open. There's lots and lots of different kinds of opportunities. And yeah, I mean, I would love it if more and more people seriously consider it and contribute in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure speaking with you, Keshav.
Thank you so much, Ayush. Same here.
Thank you so much for watching Policy Pod. I hope you liked our latest episode. to get regular updates about Policy Pod and other episodes on public policy India, please do subscribe to this channel. A big shout out to Gaurav and Yash, without whom this Policy Pod would not be possible. Uh, in case you have any suggestions for us or any comments for us, there's a link in the description below where you can give your suggestions. Thank you so much for tuning in.